Okay, we are going to begin. We are continuing where we left off last week, which was we had met the Zugot, the beginning of the Zugot. Here you see Yossi ben Yoezer, Ish Tzreida, Yossi ben Yochanan, Ish Yushalayim. And last week we saw that the Yossi ben Yoezer had a certain tact of what we need to do in terms of um, fighting the forces of assimilation, and he was make sure that you surround yourself with Torah, right? That your house should be a place of sages, and we spoke about all the positive values that encapsulated. You could interpret this next statement from Yossi ben Yochanan, Ish Yerushalayim, as a counterpoint, that they're arguing. And he's saying, no, the way to deal with all this assimilation is not to sort of turn inwards and be exclusive, focusing only on those who are inside the paradigm of Torah scholars, but to actually open up our houses wide. All right, he says, Yossi ben Yochanan Ish Yerushalayim Omer, that you should make your house as wide as possible, to have as many different people come in, and you be the teacher. You inspire them. That's how you deal with these challenges. We've seen this again and again and again, that there's an argument in pirkei avot between elitism versus the amcha. What's the best way for Judaism to continue to focus only on those that are truly committed and able and capable to learn Torah, or to expand the breadth of Torah and who it can reach? That's one way of reading the text, but I think there's another way that simply doesn't show Yossi ben Yochanan as disagreeing, but rather adding. And the counterpoint that might exist is the fact of where they come from. So Yossi ben Yoezer comes from a small town, Sreida. So perhaps he felt there was a need in small towns where you don't have the educational resources to really seize anytime you had an opportunity of a sage coming into town to grab him and learn from him. Whereas Yossi ben Yochanan, who lives in Yerushalayim, that was not necessarily the problem. There are many institutions of Jewish learning, Shivot and Batei Knesset, and so therefore he didn't feel that same pressure. But he would have felt perhaps something different, and that is in a big city like Yerushalayim, there are more likely to be people who are suffering from poverty, who are hungry, who are anonymous. In a small town, everyone knows if someone is suffering, and perhaps there's a more cohesive unit to provide for them. But maybe in Yerushalayim, people can fall between the cracks. And so perhaps Yossi ben Yochanan is trying to encourage a focus on chesed. He's not talking about Torah per se, but rather the acts of chesed, and that's his particular focus, but he's not disagreeing necessarily with his counterpart. If that's true, you see that actually it fits nicely with a few of the Mishnayot we've been learning. If we go up to right before we're introduced to Yossi ben Yoezer, we have Antigonus. Antigonus reminds us that we should not serve God as on the condition of getting a reward. So he focused on avodah. Yossi ben Yoezer, he focused on Torah learning. And we know from even before that, Rabbi Shimon Tzaddik, he said that there are three things that we need to focus on: Torah, avodah, and gimilut chasadim. And so then, therefore, when we arrive at Yossi ben Yochanan, it makes sense that he's going to focus on the third pillar of the Jewish tradition, which is chesed. So now let's read that insight. Read what he has to say with that insight in mind. Yossi ben Yochanan Ish Yerushalayim Omer, Yihi Beitcha Patuach, your house should be open wide. Ler Vacha, it should be open wide to all to see. The Bar Tanura says this should be like Avram Avinu. If you see here, Yihi Beitcha Patuach, so Kebeito Shel Avram Avinu, that he was open on all four sides of his house. He had a tent. This, of course, is the basis of the chuppah. The chuppah in Jewish tradition is supposed to be symbolic of the house of Avram and Sarah, the tent of Avram and Sarah, that was open on four sides, because they pursued hospitality as much as possible. It says that Avram planted an eshel tree. An eshel is Roshei Tevot, an acronym for olive, and the eshel tree stands for achila, that you should provide people with food, shtiya, and drink, and lina, and lodging. Avram was a man of tremendous hospitality, so much so we learn from the Torah that even as he's speaking to God, he leaves the Shekhinah in order to provide hospitality for wayfarers, that people were walking by. And of course, what's beautiful about Avram's tent being open on all four sides is not simply that he was willing to host people if they came to him and they knocked on his door and they needed help. He was advertising. He was advertising that he was open to all. When you have a open on four sides, you're sending that message. It reminds me very much of the teaching with regards to Rivka, when Eliezer, Abraham's servant, goes to look for a wife for Abraham's son, Yitzchak. He creates a test. The test is, how do I know which woman will be the right woman for my master? And he says to God, the test will be if you have this woman, when I get there, provide for me drink and also for my camels, and she's the right woman. She's filled with chesed. And I love to mention that not only is this an act of chesed that he's looking for, but it's more than that even. And the question becomes, okay, it's great that she in fact fulfilled he gets to the well, and in fact the first woman he meets is Rivka, and she in fact fulfills the requirement and passes the test. But why didn't he go to anyone else? Maybe someone else would also pass the test. How does he know she's the right woman? So one answer is given by Rashi. He says that there was a miracle. The water came up to her. I always love that insight, because even though there's a miracle that's performed on her behalf, Eliezer is not convinced. He's only convinced when she actually passes the test of being filled with chesed. The Ishbitzer, however, gives another reason how he knows that he goes up to her first, because all the other women had their kad, their pitchers behind their back. Only Rivka held it on her shoulder, and essentially she was advertising, saying, not only if you ask me, will I give to you, but I want you to ask me. Here it is. I'm prepared to fulfill this act of chesed. The other women, if you asked, perhaps they would have watered Eliezer and his camels. Maybe. We don't know. But he didn't even go up to them because they sent off the vibe, the image, that they weren't interested. But Rivka sent off the message that she, in fact, wants to do it. So Rabbi Yochanan says, let your house be open wide. And we learned, like Abraham. It's interesting to note that that word rivacha has a couple other meanings. One is profit, and some suggest that you should perform chesed as if it's your profit. Realize that is how you succeed in this world, is in the same way that you would pursue a business opportunity, you should pursue a chesed opportunity with the same passion. The other meaning for Rivcha is welfare. Right? The welfare department in the state of Israel today is the Misrad Rivcha. And so you should make your house a place that's open for welfare, for those who are struggling, those who are having difficulty, and try to help rehabilitate them. Of course, that makes sense with the next line, V'yu aniim b'nei beitecha, that these poor should be part of your house, that you should treat them as members of your household, that you should give them honor and dignity, right? It's one thing to help a person out when they're in financial need, but if you do so and embarrasses them and makes them feel guilty over needing that assistance, you've perhaps done more damage than good. So treat them with tremendous, tremendous respect. I think there's a couple other things we could say about this phrase, that they should be like members of your beitecha, of your house. One of them is the first statement says your house should be open wide for all people who are in need. That was certainly something that Yerushalayim was known for, right? It's said that one of the miracles is that even though all of the Jewish world would come to Yerushalayim 3 times a year, there's always space for them. There's always food for everyone. That means everyone in Yerushalayim opened up their homes for lodging, for eating, that the people of Yerushalayim were known for being filled with chesed and hospitality. And there are many different traditions how they would put outside their door that people could come in. If a cloth was outside the door, that means people could come in for a meal. Um, and the concept of providing hospitality is tremendously rooted within Judaism. Of course, there's a tradition that some people would be buried with part of their table, because their table, the Midrash tells us, ever since the Beit HaMikdash has been destroyed and we no longer have a temple that atones, our table atones for our sins, meaning the amount of hospitality we are able to perform is what enables us to achieve atonement in this world. And there are some, as I said, they would be buried with part of their table, because the table would be almost like a lawyer on their behalf. As they would go up to heaven, the table would argue, look how much chesed this person did for them. But there's a great challenge in this statement as well, that your house be open to wide for the welfare of all people. Uh, it may seem a little bit daunting. How is it possible? Right? I only have so much food. I can, even if I give the person a meal now, they may be hungry tomorrow and I won't be able to help them. It becomes such a daunting task. And indeed, the Gemara says that there will never be a time when the poor will cease to exist in Israel. So it may be like a never-ending Sisyphus type of task. We will never succeed. So perhaps you're going to give up before you even start the process. And I think that's what maybe this teaching then comes to tell us. Let them be like members of your household. Just because you can't feed everyone doesn't mean you can't make a difference in one person's life. It's the famous starfish story about the man walking down who sees a beach riddled with starfish, and he starts throwing them in back into the water one by one. To which someone says, there's thousands of these. How is it possible? You're not going to make a difference. They're going to keep coming back onto the sea. And he takes one and he throws it into the water. He says, yeah, but I made a difference for that one. And so similarly, you can make a difference for one person. One of the ways we learn that is through our children, right? You wouldn't say, because he may be hungry tomorrow and maybe tomorrow will be a challenge, I won't provide for him today. No, you focus on what you can do, and you'll do everything you can for your child. And similarly, so if you treat them like members of your household, you realize that I don't give up just because I can't solve all the problems, but I will nevertheless treat him like my child, and do as much as I can in this particular regard. And there's a lot more we could say in terms of the importance of chesed and hospitality on this statement, but I want to move on to the third statement that Rabbi Yochanan makes, which is perhaps the most challenging of all of them. After he says, make your house open to everyone, and you should treat the poor as members of your house, and you should go above and beyond in providing for them. Elsewhere, it says, the Bartanora says, that you should do the service, not just your servants, but you. There's a value in you connecting directly with the poor. I would even take that a step further before I get to the third statement. Part of the idea of being open to all, some have suggested you should be in an area where there are poor people. That one of the things that has taken place in the modern world is that we've separated ourselves, that we live behind gated communities. By the way, it's not just a modern experience. The Gemara in Bava Batra tells the story of a person who wanted to put a door on the chatzer. There was a joint courtyard. A number of households shared this courtyard, and he wanted to put a door to secure from people who might be walking by in the streets outside the courtyard from just entering in. And he was challenged and says, if you do this, that means the poor will no longer be able to knock on our doors. And the Gemara, in a sense, condemns this individual by telling us that prior to putting on the door with the locked gate, Eliyahu Navi, Elijah the prophet, used to visit him regularly. And after he put it on, Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu Navi, no longer visited him. Was it because Eliyahu Navi was amongst the poor and could not get in, or because he saw that the poor were being excluded? Whatever the case may be, clearly there's this idea that we should not separate ourselves so significantly from the needs of the needy that we don't actually even see them. And we sort of live blissfully thinking that they don't exist. There's something quite midat stone, the quality of Sodom in this idea that you don't even see the needs of people. That's what these gated communities do to a certain extent. Already in the times of the Talmud, they were concerned about that. And so make your house open, make it a place where you will see that we should have interaction between people of different backgrounds and experiences. Make sure that we have that ability. And that's an important concept. I would say parenthetically reminds me of a book called The Geography of Bliss, that is seeing people who are happy in the world and what might cause them to be happy, which countries. And one of the countries where people are not actually happy is Qatar, where there's a tremendous amount of wealth. And the question is, why are they not happy if there's so much wealth? And one of the studies suggests that, 70, 80 years ago, before oil was discovered, before they were wealthy, they were a very tribal community, and 70 members of an extended family would gather together in a tent, and they'd have a big feast all the time, and there was a closeness. And once they became fabulously wealthy, they built these palaces behind high gates, and people don't interact with one another and as much anymore. They don't need to go out as much anymore. They have everything they need. They have their pool. They have their indoor bowling alleys. They have everything they need. So therefore, and everything they don't need, and therefore they don't go out. Therefore, they're disconnected. And so there's a value in not only that you should be aware that there are needy people in this world, and that's, as I said, the Bartanor's point, that you yourself should serve. You should have a connection. You should realize this situation. It will sensitize you. But it is also for your benefit, going back to the earlier point we made, that your house should be open for profit, for your benefit. You should have an open house, because being connected with more people is a meaningful experience, and you should not close yourself off. Otherwise, it actually might cause some type of disconnection, not only from other people, but from your own sense of happiness. And then we get to the third point, which I said was a little bit more challenging. Ve'al tarbeh sicha im ha'isha, and don't increase conversation with a woman. B'ishto amru, they said this about a person's wife. Kal v'chomer b'isha chavero, all the more so with regards to the wife of your friend. Mikan amru chachamim, from this the sages said. Now I should point out that this is a later addition. Right? This is not part of Yossi ben Yochanan's original statement. It's a Talmudic statement that most likely originated outside of the land of Israel, in Bavel, and perhaps suggests a even greater sense of concern of mixing of the sexes that existed in Talmudic times and in Bavel than it did in Israel itself. Mikan amru chachamim, the sages said, kol zman she'adam marbeh sicha im ha'isha, all the amount of time that a person increases his conversation with the woman, the wife, gorem ra'a la'atzmo, he causes evil for himself. Botel midivri Torah, he wastes time. He gives up on learning Torah. Sofo yoresh Gehenim, and very quite dramatic. He will inherit Gehenim, which is the equivalent of Jewish understanding of hell. Wow! So it becomes a really strong statement about not conversing with women, including one's wife. Now, there are different interpretations of what might take place. I do think it's also the Bartanor who says that we're referring here specifically to a woman who is in Nida. So he says, don't talk to your wife too much while she's in Nida, because that then you may violate certain prohibitions there. And obviously, it's even all the more so with someone who is not your wife. I'm not fully convinced by that statement by the Bartanor. But even if we take him out of the picture, what does it mean you shouldn't have conversation with your wife or women in general? Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg actually sees this as a progression. This statement was made in a time where there was the segregation of the sexes, that women showed their modesty by remaining segregated and inside their homes. And so therefore, there was a need. The only way to maintain modesty in those days was to have this separation. And one of the things that we see in the modern world, hopefully, is that you can still maintain modesty as women have entered into the workplace and into the world in generally, and you can still maintain modesty in that way. Of course, it's always a challenge, but that is one of the new paradigms that exist today. I'd like to offer Rav Hirsch's statement. But before I get to Rav Hirsch, the traditional way I think of understanding this um, is based upon what we've said about the two previous statements, right? Very often these statements are connected to one another. Rabbi Yosef ben Yochanan, if we sort of accumulate everything we've said up until now, is arguing that you have to be open to everyone. You have to have an open house. Well, when you do that, you take chances, right? It means you expose your children, you expose yourself um, to all different types of people. And there's something wonderful in that. And you're able to have an impact on them, but they also might have an impact on you. And so when you open up your house so wide, there will be men and women, of course, um, and there will be men and women of various levels of modesty and impropriety and morality, and that could be a challenge. And so, therefore, he says, you open up your house, but make sure that you also protect yourself and protect your family. And one of the ways to do so in terms of laws of modesty is not to break the formal barrier that may exist between you and those of the opposite sex. Okay, I think that's probably a fair reading of what Yossi ben Yochanan is actually getting at in this point. Before I share with you Rav Hirsch, let me add one more parenthetical point that perhaps I should have mentioned earlier with regards to uh, let them be, the poor be like the B'nai Beitecha, members of your household. This is actually based upon the insight of my daughter, Gabriella, who made, I thought, a very nice point with regards to the difference between Lot and Abraham. Lot, when he engages in hospitality, he does it all himself. Um, and we're semi-impressed with that. We're not blown away, but we're impressed that he actually has a good heart and he was raised well by Abraham. But of course, there's something lacking there. There's something that we don't want to aspire to in Lot's example. And what she suggested is when you look at Abraham, he runs to provide hospitality, but he also includes members of his household. He gets everyone involved in the process. He gets, of course, his wife Sarah is involved, heavily involved, as well as the other young men in the area. And that's really the distinction between Abraham and Lot, is that Abraham sees hospitality not as just something that he's obligated to do, but he's also obligated to educate his children in. And that's the Jewish way of hospitality, is that the entire family participates. And perhaps that's what's also getting at when they say, B'nai Beitecha, your entire house has to be involved. The reason I mention that here is because what Rav Hirsch suggests assumes that there is a great partnership taking place between the whole family providing this hospitality, in particular between the leaders of the family, the husband and the wife, the mother and the father. So he reads it as follows. Don't increase sicha, conversation with your wife. Well, sicha, he points out, is a negative form of conversation. There are elevated levels of conversation. But sicha, and quotes, for example, if you look later for example, in the sixth parak of Pirkei Avot, when there are 48 ways to improve Torah, one of them is mute sicha, to minimize your sicha, your conversation. Or in the third chapter, we are told there's such a thing called sichat yeladim, and this is one of the things that takes you out of this world. Sichat yeladim seems to be like nonsense talk, right? Just gossip, just talking for the sake of talking, chattering. And so perhaps the way we should read it is, do not increase meaningless conversation with your wife. But that's not to exclude meaningful conversation. Indeed, if we read in the full context of what Rabbi Yossi ben Yochanan is saying, is this venture of opening your house wide has to be a joint venture. Has to be a joint venture between the entire family, and a particularly meaningful venture between the husband and wife. And it's important to view one's wife, view one's spouse, as your partner, as a partner, an equal partner in trying to do meaningful things in this world. And hospitality, of course, is one of the most meaningful things. And so he says, it's a matter of respect to the woman in your life, that you speak not in sicha, not in nonsense, meaningful, flimsy talk. Perhaps that is the way some men and women do speak, that it's sort of flirting, um, and doesn't have much meaning, in a sense that reinforces the traditional stereotypes of men and women, and particularly of men viewing women as objects. And he says, don't do that. Don't increase sicha between you and your wife, but view her as an equal, and an equal intellectually, spiritually, morally. And then that would then follow, of course, with you certainly should view other women that same way, at least with your wife. You know her unique qualities, and hopefully that will prevent you from treating her merely as an object. But when you look at the whole outside world of the opposite sex, when men look at women, they may tend to objectify women and only think of them in those sort of object terms, and especially because they don't know of the other qualities, because they haven't gotten to know them. So don't speak to that person either in such flimsy, flirty. Of course, there's a problem with that, in that regard. Um, and if we understand that way of speaking, um, that's or of Hirsch's understanding of this, perhaps it also adds another layer to what the Chachamim say at the end. Right? They say every time that a person engages in this conversation, he does all these terrible things, he causes damage to himself, and he destroys divrei Torah. I think the pshat certainly is they're talking about sexual immodesty. You cause danger to yourself. You, of course, just flirting and talking and nonsense. So that also is a waste of time and waste divrei Torah. V'sofo yoresh Gehenim, and at the end he will inherit Gehenim. Maybe he'll have negativity in this regard. But if we take Rav Hirsch's understanding and add one other insight, Gehenim was actually a valley, right? The valley of Hinnom in Yerushalayim. And historically, it had a number of different roles that it played. At one point in time, garbage was thrown into there. Prior to the Jewish people's entry into land, and perhaps concurrent to their trying to conquer the land, there were the people of Moloch. Moloch sacrificed their children. We're told in the Torah, don't be like Moloch, who sacrifices their children. And when you do the historical study, we are told that actually many of the rituals where they would kill their children, making them force their way through fire and then disposed of these children, took place in Gei Hinnom, in this valley, the Gehenim that we call today Gehenim. And so perhaps there is an allusion to that your children will be damaged if you do this type of activity. What's the damage? Well, if you don't treat, now I'm speaking from the male perspective, if you don't treat your wife with respect, that you only engage in sicha, you marbe sicha, just this sort of flimsy, not just playful, but meaningless banter. And that's your whole nature of your relationship. It's not based on anything deeper, spiritually deeper, morally deeper, purposefully deeper. You have the same purpose as you go through life as partners. If you don't have that and your children don't see that, so then in a sense, they inherit something on a spiritual level, an emotional level, similar to the children who were killed by Moloch. They don't see the role models of their parents working together. And that, of course, can be devastating to their own emotional well-being and upbringing. And that we have to avoid as well.